We're going to look at different operations we can use with positive and negative numbers. And we're going to start with adding or subtracting. Oftentimes people struggle with adding and subtracting because when they look at multiplying and dividing, we have a set of rules. For example, whenever I multiply a positive and a negative, I get a negative answer. With adding and subtracting, it's not the same. If I'm adding a positive and a negative, sometimes my answer is positive and sometimes it's negative. So before I go into the rules on how you determine that, I want to point a couple things out. The first being that we're never going to subtract. We're always going to think of it as the sign belongs to the number it's in front of, and we're just going to add those two numbers together. And whenever we have two minuses in a row, we have to make those become a positive or become a plus. In fact, we have to do that before we even think about the sign belonging to the number it's in front of. That's always going to be our first step when we see that. So when we are adding numbers with the same sign, so I'm going to give you two separate sets of rules. When you're adding numbers with the same sign, whether they're all positive or all negative, we're going to add the two numbers and keep the same sign. When we're adding numbers with different signs, so one's positive and one's negative, we're going to start by ignoring any negatives to help us determine which number is bigger and which number is smaller. So essentially we're looking at the absolute value of each number. We're going to take the big number minus the small number, and we're going to keep the sign of the bigger number. So if the bigger number is negative, my answer is negative. If my bigger number is positive, my answer is positive. This is the process I'm going to go through on all of my examples. I'm going to slow myself down to make sure I'm not making errors on these. I'm first going to determine, are my signs the same or different? From that, I'll be able to determine which process I'm going to use. Am I doing add the two numbers or big number minus small number? What sign should my answer have? And then finally, what's my final answer? What's my correct answer? So I'm going to have to, well, I can actually probably leave that on the screen for the first three. There's 6 examples total. On the first one, first thing I'm going to ask myself is, are the signs the same or different? Well, I have a negative 48 and a positive 37, so my signs are different. Because my bigger number is negative, I know my answer is going to be negative. Because my signs are different, I know I'm going to do big number minus small number. So the bigger number between 48, because I'm ignoring that negative, between 48 and 37 is 48. So 48 subtract 37 gives me 11. So for my final answer, because I already noted that it should be negative, I get negative 11. Doing the same thing for the second one. Again, I'm going to, the sign belongs to the number it's in front of, so I'm going to say this is an 87, which is positive, and a negative 94, so therefore my signs are different. Because they're different, I'm going to take the sign of the bigger number, and 94 is bigger than 87, so my answer should be negative. And I'm going to go ahead and say big number minus small number because the signs are different, and that's my process for different signs. So 94 minus 87, I get 7. But again, my answer needs to be negative, so I have to go back and add that negative on. Looking at my third example, this is a situation where I have a minus minus right in a row. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change that minus a minus to plus. So that's going to become plus, making my new problem negative 26 plus 58. So I have a negative 26 and a positive 58. So again, I have different signs. Taking the sign of the bigger number, and the previous two examples, my bigger number was negative. Now my bigger number 58 is positive, so my answer is going to be positive. Still going to do big number minus small number. My process doesn't change. (58) minus 26 gives me 32, and since my answer was supposed to be positive, 32 is my final answer. Looking at 3 more examples. If you would like to pause the video and try them on your own and then watch them, this is a good time for you to practice and see if you understand this process. Now that you've had the chance to try some, let's go ahead and look at number 4. On example 4, I'm going to go ahead and first notice that I have a negative 88 and a negative 42. So this is a situation where now my signs are the same. Since my signs are the same, I still take the sign of the bigger number, so negative. And notice that when my signs are the same, it doesn't matter which is bigger because they're both the same sign. So I really can just say I'm going to keep the same sign as both my numbers. I'm going to add my two numbers together. And I get 130. However, my answer is supposed to be negative, so for my final answer, I say negative 130. And it should make sense. If you think of it, sometimes positives and negatives, it's helpful to think of temperature. If it's negative 88 degrees out and it drops 42 more degrees, isn't it even colder? So even colder, negative 130. Moving on to number 5. On number 5, I see I have a positive 73 and a negative 108. So since there's two signs in front of the negative 108, the negative will trump the positive here. And I'm going to go ahead and say that means my signs are different. So since they're different, I keep the sign of the bigger number, which is negative 108. So my answer will be negative. Keeping the same process I used earlier, I'm going to do big number minus small number. 108 minus 73 gives me 35, but my answer should be negative, so I get a negative 35. And again, if you think about temperature, if it's 73 degrees out and it drops 108 degrees, we're going to be at negative 35. Looking at the final example, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to notice I have a minus in a row, so I'm going to make that a plus, giving me negative 43 plus 67, which means I have different signs. It also means that I take the sign of the bigger number, which is 67, so it's going to be a positive answer. And I'm also going to do big number minus small number. So I'm going to go ahead and say 67 minus 43 gives me 24, and my answer was supposed to be positive, so 24 is my final answer. Some of you will not have to write this process down, especially once you get it. If I were working this on my own, I would not write all these steps out. I have a pretty good concept of how positives and negatives work. If you don't, if you know that you have made many mistakes in the past with positives and negatives, go through this process. Make sure you get it right. It may take you an extra 30 seconds, but it will be worth it if you're getting the correct answer. There is a very large difference between having a negative 130 and a positive 130. So make sure you get these rules down. The difference between adding numbers with same side and adding numbers with different sides. I know this video had the majority of the examples with different signs, mainly because same signs is, I think, the easier of the two. However, we will do some work in class that does have more with the same sign.